After World War II, the world was effectively divided into spheres of influence between two blocs with different social systems. The USSR sought to expand and strengthen the so-called socialist camp. Western countries, led by the United States, sought to destroy this camp by incorporating socialist countries into their sphere of influence. Despite this difference between the two systems, commonalities also underlay the conflict. Both systems were based on the principles of industrial society, which demanded industrial growth and, consequently, increased resource consumption. However, the relative parity of power between the blocs, and subsequently the real threat of nuclear annihilation in the event of a war between the USSR and the United States, kept the rulers of the two powers from direct confrontation. On March 5, 1946, speaking in the presence of US President Truman Fulton, Churchill called on the Anglo-Saxon world, that is, the United States, Great Britain, and their allies, to repel the USSR. Fulton's speech became a kind of declaration of the Cold War. In 1946 to 1947, the USSR increased pressure on Crete and Turkey. A civil war was raging in Crete, and the USSR was demanding that Turkey be given territory for a military base in the Mediterranean. Truman, in turn, declared his readiness to contain the USSR worldwide. This position became known as the Truman Doctrine and meant an end to cooperation between the victors of fascism. The Cold War had begun. About a third of the population of France and Italy supported the communist parties. The poverty of war-ravaged Europeans provided fertile ground for communist success. In 1947, U.S. Secretary of State George Marshall announced that the United States was ready to provide material aid to European countries for economic recovery. Initially, even the USSR joined in aid negotiations. But it soon became clear that American aid would not be provided to countries ruled by communists. The Europeans were required to remove communists from their governments. Eastern European countries did not participate in the plan. In January 1949, most Eastern European countries united in an economic union, the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance. In April 1949, the United States, Canada, and several Western European countries created the North Atlantic Alliance, NATO. The USSR and Eastern European countries responded only in 1955 by creating their own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. The division of Europe had a particularly severe impact on Germany. The dividing line ran through the country's territory. East Germany was occupied by the USSR, the West, the United States, Great Britain, and France. They also controlled the western half of Berlin. In 1948, West Germany was included in the Marshall Plan, but East Germany was not. Stalin decided to exploit the situation to blockade it, hoping to capture the entire German capital and extract concessions from the United States. However, the Americans organized an airlift to Berlin and broke the blockade. In May of that year, the lands in the Western Occupation Zone united to form the Federal Republic of Germany. In October 1949, the German Democratic Republic, GDR, was established in the Soviet occupation zone. The rivalry between the USSR and the US inevitably led to an arms buildup by both blocs. The adversaries sought superiority in nuclear weapons and their delivery systems. The hot gases, rising upward, slowly cooled and were shrouded in smoke. In 1949, the USSR tested its own atomic bomb. The possession of the bomb by the USSR deterred the US from using atomic weapons in Korea, although this possibility was already real and had been discussed with high-ranking US military officials. The first clash of the two systems occurred in China. After World War II, northeast China, occupied by the Soviet Army, was handed over to the People's Liberation Army of China. They received Japanese weapons captured by the Soviets. The rest of the country was subordinated to the Kuomintang government led by Chiang Kai-shek. Initially, national elections were planned in China to determine who would rule the country, but both sides were uncertain of victory, and instead of elections, China erupted into civil war in 1946 to 1949. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, emerged victorious. The second major clash of two systems in Asia occurred in Korea. After World War II, The country was split into two occupation zones, Soviet and American. In 1948, the USSR and the US withdrew their troops, leaving Korea in the hands of their proxies. The Soviet leader Kim Il-sung was in the north, and the American leader Ri Sin-man was in the south. In June 1950, the Korean War began, involving the US, China, and a small contingent of other countries. During this war, Soviet pilots encountered American pilots for the first time in Asian skies. Despite heavy casualties on both sides, the war ended almost where it had begun. The Cold War led to repression in both camps against thoughtful individuals who advocated cooperation and rapprochement between the two systems. In the USSR and Eastern European countries, people were arrested on charges of cosmopolitanism, sycophancy toward the West, and titanism in their ties to Tito. A witch hunt began in the US, exposing secret communists and Soviet agents. In 1959, Khrushchev visited the United States. This was the first visit by a Soviet leader to America. He was greatly impressed by American society. He was particularly struck by the successes of agriculture, which was much more efficient than in the USSR. However, by that time, the USSR had also managed to surprise the United States. On October 4, 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first artificial satellite, Sputnik. From then on, a Soviet rocket could deliver cargo anywhere on the planet, including a nuclear device. In 1958, the Americans launched their own satellite and began mass production of rockets. Successes in space exploration had enormous propaganda value. They demonstrated the kind of social system capable of achieving great scientific and technological advances. On April 12, 1961, the USSR launched a manned spacecraft into space. The first cosmonaut was Yuri Gagarin. In the 1960s, relations between the USSR and the United States deteriorated again. On May 1st, shortly before the Soviet-American summit, the United States sent a U-2 reconnaissance aircraft over Soviet territory. Flying at altitudes beyond the reach of Soviet fighters, it was shot down by a missile during a May Day demonstration in Moscow. At the summit, Khrushchev expected an apology from Eisenhower. Not receiving one, he cut the meeting short. The new U.S. President, John F. Kennedy, attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro's pro-communist regime in Cuba. This operation had been prepared by the Central Intelligence Agency during Eisenhower's tenure. The Americans hoped to overthrow Castro by the Cubans themselves, but the landing of a counter-revolutionary in Cuba ended in their complete defeat. Kennedy had barely recovered from this defeat when he was faced with a new crisis. At his very first meeting with the new American president in April 1961, Khrushchev demanded a change in the status of West Berlin. Berlin was used by Western intelligence agencies, and cultural and trade exchanges took place through its territory, uncontrolled by the authorities. Kennedy refused to make concessions to the USSR and East Germany, leading to the Berlin Crisis. In August 1961, East German authorities surrounded West Berlin with a wall, which became a symbol of the division of Europe and Germany into two hostile parts, a symbol of the Cold War. By that time, the Soviet Union was surrounded on all sides by American military bases housing nuclear weapons. While vacationing in Crimea, Khrushchev noticed that even his beach was within direct range of American missiles in Turkey. The Soviet leader decided to put America in the same position. The Soviet leadership decided to install medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. Now any US city could be wiped off the map in minutes. After American intelligence detected Soviet missiles stationed in Cuba, the Cuban Missile Crisis erupted in October 1962. Following a crisis that brought the world to the brink of nuclear missile catastrophe, a compromise was reached. The USSR removed its missiles from Cuba, and the US withdrew its missiles from Turkey and guaranteed Cuba non-intervention. The Cuban Missile Crisis taught both Soviet and American leaders a great deal. The leaders of the superpowers realized they could lead humanity to ruin. Having reached a dangerous point, the Cold War began to wane. In the 1960s, the US became bogged down in Indochina, and the USSR became embroiled in a conflict with China. As a result, both superpowers opted to transition from the Cold War to a policy of gradual détente. In December 1979, NATO decided to deploy the latest American Pershing II and Tomahawk missiles in Western Europe. A wave of rallies and protests against the missile deployment erupted in Western European countries, as in the event of a first American strike, Europe, not America, would become the target of a Soviet retaliatory strike. The new US President, Ronald Reagan, proposed the so-called zero option in 1981, the withdrawal of all Soviet and American medium-range nuclear missiles from Europe. In this case, British and French missiles aimed at the USSR would remain there. The final détente was sealed by the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The Cold War resumed. In 1980–82, the US imposed a series of economic sanctions against the USSR. In 1983, the US president called the USSR an evil empire. The installation of new American missiles in Europe began. By the mid-1980s, the socialist countries entered a period of crisis. The country found it increasingly difficult to bear the burden of the Cold War, support allied regimes around the world, and wage war in Afghanistan. In March 1985, a new General Secretary, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in the USSR. In 1985–86, he proclaimed a policy of sweeping reforms known as perestroika. In 1989, the reforms implemented by the communists in Eastern Europe escalated into revolutions. Along with the communist regime in East Germany, the Berlin Wall was also torn down, symbolizing the end of the division of Europe. In December 1988, Gorbachev announced a unilateral reduction of the army at the UN. In February 1989, Soviet troops withdrew from Afghanistan, where the war between the Mujahideen and the Najibullah government continued. In December 1989, off the coast of Malta, Gorbachev and the new US President George W. Bush were able to discuss the de facto end of the Cold War. The end of the Cold War and the collapse of the USSR had a common cause: the crisis of state socialism in the USSR. Let's comment on whether you think the US won the Cold War or whether there are no winners in this conflict. Subscribe to the channel, like it, and you can support the channel using the link in the description. You can also check out the description and see how the US lost the Vietnam War. See you there.